All right, well, hello everybody, and thank you for joining us for our December edition of Fuse Live. We are the fellowship using the science of engagement here at the University of Texas at Austin, and we're a fellowship program for secondary teachers from Texas and from around the world at this point. We have teachers from Western Europe, many states across the U.S., all joining together to learn different ideas and really the science of engagement and how they can implement different ways to think about how they're engaging with their students and building a culture of learning in their classroom. My name is Ryan Smith. I'm the director of the fellowship, so I work with the teachers and the districts and schools that join throughout their experience. And each month we hold one of these live sessions, and we take not a deep dive, but about a halfway dive into one of the practices that your teachers learn throughout their time in the fellowship. This month, we're going to be talking about exam speeches. That's a critical practice that they learn that really helps them think through how they're talking about exams, how they're using their language to help their students see that as, not a scary incident that they're going to encounter, but rather something that they can approach with confidence and with ease. So we've got a special guest, David Yeager. I'm going to introduce him here in a second. But before we jump in, I do want to just do a quick introduction of Catherine Yonda. Catherine, you can give a wave there. She's our partnership coordinator. And wherever you're watching today, whether you're watching on our LinkedIn Live or Substack or YouTube, if you have any questions or comments or anything like that along the way, you can put them in the chat right there, and we should be able to see them here, and we'll make sure we get those questions answered. As you see on the screen, it's December right now, so we've got a few months before our next cohorts launch. But we will be launching a small cohort in the spring and then a large cohort next June. I'll talk more about that near the end of our session today. But this is a great time to start having these conversations and to think through plans for next school year. You could also scan that QR code you see right there. That'll take you to our website if you want to learn any more, but you'll get a link to that in the follow-up that we'll be sending out as well. But we want to jump right in right now, and I'm going to advance us here to the next slide. And I want to introduce our very special guest who joins us many months here as part of our Fuse Lives, but isn't always able to make it. So we've got a special treat today where he's going to talk really about the founding of the fellowship and that exam speech module. But his name is Dr. David Yeager. He's the author of 10 to 25, The Science of Motivating Young People. And he's going to really shepherd us through the first part of our talk today and tell you about the Fuse origin story, the research behind Fuse, and again, that first module. And without any further ado, then I'm going to turn it over to Dr. Yeager, and he's going to take it from here. Go ahead, David.
All right, great. Thanks, everybody. So good to see you. And my dog started barking like immediately as I started this. So it's great to see you all. Thanks so much for joining. I'm a developmental scientist. I focus on adolescence and motivation. And I wrote a book called 10 to 25, The Science of Motivating Young People. And in that book, I wrote about some new insights about how to engage adolescents and young adults. And in parallel to writing that, we developed a program that is designed to equip adults with the mindsets and tools that they need in order to engage their students. And I did that in partnership with my collaborator, Dr. Carol Dweck, who wrote a book called Mindset, and also a key advisor and mentor of mine, Uri Treisman, who I also write about in my book, a well-known math instructor. And then finally, a key partner was a dual enrollment network called On-Ramps that was led by someone named Jennifer Porter, who is a wonderful educator and leader. And together we created Fuse, which I'm going to we'll explain more about it. But what I want to do is give you a little bit of the theoretical background and at a high level, and then we're going to double click on one of the practices that instructors in our network use. All right, so let's get started. So buckle up. The key organizing idea of really my book, but also of Fuse, is this concept of the adolescent predicament, which is simply the idea that it's very hard to simultaneously criticize and develop young people while also motivating them in part because there are pretty dramatic changes in adolescence owing to both puberty and social changes that cause them to have a craving for a kind of status and respect that is often the opposite of what they experience in our classrooms, in other relationships they have with adults, et cetera. And so without dwelling too much on all of the different studies, here's basically 100 years of the developmental science of adolescence in one slide. And the punchline is that teenagers' brains and hormones make them hypersensitive about status, respect, their reputations, how they feel about themselves compared to others. Basically, their view of themselves publicly and socially in light of how other people are thinking of them. That kind of comes to the foreground in adolescence. And we see a lot of examples of this. This is true in animals. So if you look at pubertal maturation in whether it's birds or chimps, you see a kind of social awakening. And of course, you see it in humans as well. And there are lots of interesting studies on this. In some of my research, we do things like give people a nasal inhaler of testosterone and see if, turning someone into a raging hormone teenager influences their judgment and decision making. But there are a lot of other more intuitive examples. But the way I like to characterize this is that anytime you're talking to an adolescent, that's probably the day on which they have the most testosterone they've ever had in their entire lives. And that's going to influence their brains, their decision making, et cetera. And then the next day when you talk to them, that's now probably the day on which they have the most testosterone they've ever had in their lives. Which is to say that when we ignore that social sensitivity, that concern with status, respect, reputation, prestige, et cetera, for example, by using practices that either shame or blame or humiliate, then we run the risk of demotivating young people. So that sensitivity to status and respect increases a fear of failure, specifically the kinds of failures that are viewed as public mistakes in which young people are viewed as less than in some way. And that happens in the classroom. It can happen in their social lives as well. Now, that's not all bad because this social sensitivity also helps young people figure out what counts for status and respect in their cultures. And so it can drive learning, actually. And once you know that, have that understanding, then it's possible to harness adolescent sensitivities and use that to promote deeper engagement in learning. And so Fuse is basically saying that, that phenomenon where it just seems impossible to reach young people. It seems like they rebel, they don't listen, et cetera. What if we could turn that on its head and instead harness young people's motivations and what captures their attention, and then direct it toward learning that's good for them and others in the long run. And we share this message in a lot of interesting ways with the faculty in our Fuse program. So we describe hormones and the way they work and how they affect young people. We provide this argument about the sensitivity to status and respect. And then the key insight is this part that's bolded in the middle, which is that even completely innocuous interactions that most adults wouldn't think twice about can be interpreted by adolescents as signs that we don't respect them or don't take them seriously. And the flip side of that, though, is that a small demonstration of respect, we argue, is a powerful tool at a teacher's disposal to try to capture adolescents' motivation. All right. And so we want to, instead of thinking of adolescents as like hopelessly, damaged by the hormones raging in their brain, instead they're sensitive to one type of communication or another. And therefore, we now have a tool at our disposal to try to capture their attention and motivation through better, more respect-forward communication. And then, of course, we explain how that works in the classroom, right? So if students come to see their teachers as thinking that they aren't smart enough, that they can't do it, that they're not worth their time, then students will feel disrespected, we argue. However, if we instead frame our practices in the classroom as part of our commitment to their learning, no matter how much they're struggling, then adolescents view that as a sign of respect. And then, of course, we show some testimonials, students learn, and then they write on their own. Okay, so what are the kinds of communication practices that don't work? Well, in my book, I coined this term grown-splaining, and now I'm going to mansplain grown-splaining to you. This is very simply the idea that we often think in our heads as adults that we know the right choices young people should make, that their choices are ill-advised, etc. And so because of that, we then think, if only I could export my smart adult brain thinking to their kind of insufficient adolescent brain, then they would understand what they should do and they would make better choices. And so we basically talk to adolescents the way Americans speak in foreign countries when they don't speak the language, and they just yell English louder at people, right? And so that's kind of what we end up doing a lot in our classrooms. And even though, of course, in our minds as adults, we think we're right about what we're saying, it's still the case that from a young person's perspective, it comes across in the wrong way. And specifically, it comes across in a disrespectful way. And because of that, then we end up with this kind of frustrating scenario where we explain to a young person what choice they should make or what they should be doing. They get offended and get mad at us. We then are mad that they're not listening to us, and we escalate, and then they feel yelled at for no reason. It's like we say one thing, they hear another, and there's a fight over the miscommunication. And so in Fuse, we want to try to help people overcome this classic dilemma through more effective communication practices. And so how in general do we recommend that we can stop fearing adolescent development and start harnessing it? That was the organizing question around Fuse. So we call it Fellowship Using the Science of Engagement, because it is a fellowship of teachers working together. We're trying to apply the science of engagement. Also, it's worth noting that the letters in our logo are fused together. That was one of my contributions, which I'm very proud of. But in all seriousness, what we really are excited about is equipping teachers to try to communicate in a more effective way, so that way we can capture adolescents' motivation. We have a few different sets of practices. We kind of work on different levels. One of the things we equip people with is tools to promote what we call a culture of learning. And that's our kind of newfangled graphic is on the left there. If you can't tell, that's a pyramid. It's like, a 3D shape coming at you. And what we're trying to represent in the figure on the left is that there are three kind of bases that form the foundation for your classroom culture of learning: a culture that continually supports students' growth and improvement, in part because it shows that sign of respect to young people, which then captures their motivation. And the three parts are: first, what do we as faculty and instructors believe? So what is the culture that we are intending to create? Then the bottom right is, what are our policies and procedures? How are we actually grading in ways that promote growth and learning? How are we affording the opportunity for revisions, for example, or ways for students to get points after they make mistakes, et cetera? So it has to kind of rubber meets the road. A culture of learning has to be instantiated in our actual policies. And then on the bottom left is, what is our language of communication, which is, how are we even communicating this culture? And that's important because students will have experienced other cultures before they come to our classes. They might have experienced very authoritarian, aggressive cultures. They might have experienced very passive, low standards cultures. Whatever it is, they may not be prepared for the rigorous, growth-oriented, respectful cultures that we're trying to create. And so we need to be smart about how we communicate with young people. And that bottom left one, it turns out, is there's a lot of leverage in optimizing that language of communication. On the right is a graphic, which is another set of practices, which simply equips teachers with what they need to know about the science of memory and learning. So that way, the content they're presenting is more likely to end up in long-term memory and therefore be accessible to students in the future. So we teach educators about the different steps in the learning process, from encoding to storage to retrieval, and the kind of counterintuitive implications of those insights. Okay, but today we're really going to focus a little more on on the culture of learning. That's where our exam speeches practice focuses on. But just so you know the breadth of what we try to equip educators with, on the left is some of our practices, such as reframing mistakes, the science of memory, engaging brains with prediction, mining mistakes. On the right is exam speeches, engaged retrieval. So how do students retrieve information from memory in ways that cause it to be more accessible, and more. Today we're going to focus on that top right one, exam speeches, and really double click on that. Okay, so this is a practice that is designed to help promote a culture of learning, and it is really a combination of your language and communication, and then also explaining your policies and procedures to students. All right, so let's double click on this. We'll try to go over this efficiently. Why are we focusing on exam speeches? Well, the issue is that students feel a lot of pressure around exams, obviously. They might be stressed simply by thinking about the idea of a test, etc., and that stress can impact their performance. And then because of that stress, then a lot of interesting things can happen. So some students might self-handicap, for example, by putting off their preparation for later. Others might prepare in a way that they feel as though it's going to go well, but then they take the test and they don't see that preparation reflected in their grades, so they get discouraged. So that's another huge issue. Another thing around exams is students worry, if I don't do well, then maybe my teacher will think I'm done with this subject, or I'm not worth their time, or maybe my parents will think, I lack character because I wasn't trying hard enough, right? So basically, exams, big and small, are loaded with meaning for a young person, and they're a potential sign of their competence in that discipline. And of course, if you feel incompetent in a discipline, or if you're made to feel incompetent, then that lowers your sense of status and respect. Okay. So exams are interesting because they are this moment that could be a big signal of status and respect in the class, whether it is doing well and then gaining a better reputation, or doing poorly and having people look down on you. Okay. So what I'm not arguing is that students shouldn't take exams, okay, or that we shouldn't have grades, right? That almost is what I call a protector mindset in my book, which is remove all sorts of distress from students to protect them from the negative consequences. We're not arguing that. Instead, we're arguing that you can frame the exam experience in a more status respect aligned way, so that students embrace the challenge. They are resilient, even if they mess up and get things wrong. They seek out the challenges that allow them to learn. And then their emotions are more stable, even depending on relatively low performance or just needing to put forth a lot of effort. And the way to do that is through better language and communication. And that we think of it in 3 steps. So one is like before the exam, what can you say? The second is on the day of the exam, what can you say? And the third is when you hand back the exam, what can you say? We think about each of those as almost, you could call them mindset moments, right? And like imagine a student before an exam. I'm sitting there and I'm like, okay, I'm anxious about this assessment. It's going to, evaluate and judge me. It's going to maybe determine my future, or at least how I'm viewed. Okay, so that's the worry a student might have. So then what can a teacher say in that moment to help students basically be more confident and optimistic? Okay. And so what we do in Fuse is we give teachers a set of principles for having basically a speech that they can give in their class the day or two before the exam, while the students are trying to prepare for that exam. So one is reiterating your belief in students' potential to do well. The second is share an effective strategy for preparation, mainly that students should prepare by doing the problems that are challenging for them, right? Rather than only, because what happens is students just do the easy problems to convince themselves that they're fine, right? It's almost like a form of self-soothing, is they go to the problems they've already mastered. And then like, well, now I'm prepared. Because if they did a bunch of problems that felt hard for them, then they would say, oh, wow, I'm not prepared. I'm freaking out. And so what students actually need to be encouraged to do is to prepare by revisiting the ones that they're less comfortable with rather than the ones that they are comfortable with. And students need to be reminded of this, because if you leave students on their own, in general, they'll default to the ones that where they feel fluent. And then last is that if you encourage students to do the hard problems, then they need an interpretation or appraisal of that difficulty, right? What does it mean that you're struggling or that you feel stressed when you're working on difficult tasks? Okay. And so what we think is really important is to both encourage them to embrace the challenge of working on the tasks they haven't mastered, and give them a way of interpreting it. For example, when you find yourself doing hard problems and it's feeling very difficult, it's not a sign of hopelessness. It's not a sign you can't do it. It's actually a sign that you've been brave enough to do hard work. And on top of that, it actually means your brain is growing. You're getting smarter as you do it, and you're preparing even more by doing the hard ones. Okay. So, and there's more to it. We also talk about stress, but that kind of thing is something that teachers can learn to say and do. We also encourage teachers to not say certain things. One of the worst things to say, we found, is don't stress about it. You're prepared. You can do it. Right. Because what happens is then if students are stressed, they're like, oh my God, I'm not prepared. Right. And I see this all the time. They're like, guys, don't worry about it. We've covered it all. You're going to do great. And it's basically causing students to suppress their stress responses. And if you read my book in chapter 7, I write about suppression versus reappraisal, and what that does to young people. And basically telling them, don't worry about it, don't be stressed, you're prepared, is basically causing them to suppress how they actually feel, and that ends up making their feelings even worse. All right, day of the test. Well, there's stuff that can be done. Basically, day of test, you can't prepare. There's no cramming that's going to help you. All you got to do is perform to the level of your preparation, right? So what we do is we equip educators on basically language that helps students harness their stress response rather than shy away from it. So they learn, for example, students learn from the teachers, when your heart is pounding, your breathing is faster, and your palms are sweating, those are signs your body is preparing to take on a challenge and focus on the task at hand, rather than a sign that you're going to fail and do poorly. Okay, so we're having them reappraise even the physiological arousal that they experience when they're taking an exam. And then they also are given some very concrete strategies, like read every problem, even the ones that look hard. And that's because oftentimes on an exam, students will just skip the ones that look hard and then never get back to them, and then they get a low score. Okay, so we're causing students to embrace a challenge on the exam, and also reappraise the feeling of difficulty that comes from taking on that challenge. Okay. And then last is, now a student gets a test back. Well, student tried hard, they did their best, and they got a C. How are they going to feel, right? Are they going to say, my teacher hates me, I'm done with this subject, I don't care about this anyway, it doesn't matter to me, right? Or are they going to say, wow, 25% of these problems are things I need to master. So now I know the 25% that I need to go focus on to improve, right? Obviously, we want them to do the latter, not the former. So that moment of handing back an exam is actually really important, because students could go one of two ways, right? They could go in the direction of, I'm going to redouble my efforts and learn from my mistakes, or they could go in a downward spiral and say, I never want to look at this stuff again, right? And so we found that that's a sensitive moment for a student. And so a teacher is encouraged in Fuse to clarify their beliefs about what this one test grade means. It's like, this, you are more than a number to me. I don't just see you for your score. Then you can share how students can learn from the exam. What are steps they can take once they see their score? And then also point to policies that you have that allow students to get points back as they complete those revisions. Okay. So just as a kind of recap, across these 3 moments, before the exam, day of the exam, after the exam, you can clarify what the test means and what it doesn't mean to you. You can remind students of policies like your revision and retesting policies that are designed to support learning. And then you can clear up any misunderstandings about why we test and what the stress means. Okay, I'm going to stop there. And if there's any questions in the chat, then I can answer those. But otherwise, thank you guys so much for your attention. So Ryan, I'll stay on, see if there's any questions.
Yeah, stay on for a little bit. I have a couple questions. I know in the chat we might have some we have some comments, but no questions. And we're monitoring the Substack chat. It seems like that's where most of the conversations are right now. But I love exam speeches because I think it's a good it paints a good picture of a lot of the other practices that we do in Fuse, which is really about how we and the fellows within our program help support one another with being much more intentional about their language. And I was wondering, David, if you could say a couple words about what we've seen in the research when teachers or adults they're not as transparent as they think as they could be around some of these key points. Like if you don't say anything about an exam and you give it, you say some things like maybe don't stress, you've got this, things that as adults we say all the time. Like what kind of misinterpretations and what kind of self-talk do students often hear in that moment when as adults we're not being clear, we're not being precise with or taking advantage of that moment with our language?
So like a good example is, like a lot of teachers think if a student's confused about something, so say a student got a problem wrong on a test and you're going to walk through it with a student, or they do the study guide and they got some things wrong and you're going to try to explain it to them. And then in that moment, a teacher might ask a student an open-ended question, like explain your thinking to me here. Right? Now that sounds like a great idea, except most students interpret that kind of open-ended question as the teacher's effort to catch them for having not thought about anything and almost like they're going to punish them. And so students get offended because they think the teacher's trying to shame and blame and humiliate them by surfacing their misunderstandings. Okay. Now, if you ask teachers, why do you ask a student an open-ended question when they got something wrong? Every teacher says, oh, it's because I want the student to own the thinking. I don't want to just tell them the answers. And I want them to be able to think going forward in the future, right? So there's this disconnect, right, between what the teacher intends in that situation and how the student interprets it. And so what we found is that the conventional thing is a teacher might say, well, don't you know I'm doing this for your benefit? Or, don't get offended or stop being so sensitive. And they take a kind of suppression approach. But that doesn't work because the student already does feel offended. And so what we try to coach people to do in Fuse is to say something more like, all right, I'm going to ask you for your thinking. I'm going to do that because it's really important to me that you own your thinking going forward, that it's not, you don't just feel like you can only answer this if I'm around. And it might feel uncomfortable when I ask you to do your thinking. I just want you to know that I'm not trying to make you look bad. I'm really doing it because I respect you and I'm taking you seriously and I'm invested in your success. Now, that seems like it took a long time for me to say. And yet, if you don't say that kind of thing, at least some of the time, then students will keep interpreting your actions in the worst possible light. And so what we found is that you have to be 2 to 3 times more transparent than you think you need to be because of this adolescent predicament, this mismatch between the status and respect they want to feel and what we actually afford them.
Yeah. Can you talk a little bit too about, I know, because you're a professor here at UT, you've got, I think like 100, 125 students, similar to what, most of the secondary teachers in our fellowship have. And how it's so easy as a teacher when you've got 150 tests, or this is like a common routine thing for you, and keeping yourself from falling into that trap or reminding yourself that this test is the one thing for this student. And how, like, any tips or tricks or ways that you approach that to make sure that each student kind of feels that you understand how special this is to them?
Yeah, it's kind of like imagine you're a judge in a criminal court. You're going to see 50 cases a day, but if you're a defendant, right, that day could determine like your whole future. Like, are you going to be a convicted felon or not? Right. And are you going to have a record? And so there's a disparity between the administrative person, whether it's the judge or the teacher, and how many cases they're seeing versus the person who's more vulnerable in that moment. And so I think as a teacher, every time we grade, it's not just we're checking mechanically for information that is there or not in a student's mind. It is a social conversation, and their reputation is wrapped up in it, and their future is wrapped up in it. And also the power disparity between us as the grader and evaluator and them as the person who ideally has submitted their best work, there's a huge disparity there. And so in general, like a main finding from social psychology is that the more power you have in a situation, the less you take the perspective of the other person. And I think that happens whether it's professors or judges or police officers who stop you, on the street, or teachers, handing out exams. And so I think that you kind of have to have as a habit of mind, a sensitivity to, this might be the one moment where I might say something that could set them on a better trajectory for life. And I shouldn't waste that moment. But also I could say something wrong, and it could really be an issue. Now, so that's a kind of habit of mind, to take each moment with the sensitivity that it deserves from the perspective of the kid. I'm not arguing, though, that you're going to mess up and then ruin somebody's life, because in fact you get do-overs. So if you come across the wrong way in an evaluative setting in a classroom, you can go revisit the student and talk to them and be like, I didn't handle that the right way. And in fact, one of our facilitators is always doing this. So he might have a student ask, they get something wrong. He asks them to explain their thinking. They get stressed out and they cry, right? He'll take them aside after class and be like, look, I'm not trying to humiliate you. I'm not trying to make you cry. If you don't want me to call on you because it's too much right now, that's fine. I won't do it right now. We'll do it later. But I want you to know that I'm not trying to come down on you. I'm just invested in you and I believe in you. And then usually the student's like, okay, you're right. It's fine. You can call on me, that kind of thing. But you get do-overs, and that's kind of like, you would never do that if you thought that young people were just overreacting and being ridiculous. But if you thought, oh, they are very reasonable in their sensitivity to status and respect, and it's something I need to pay attention to, then people are more likely to be willing to do the do-over because they think that the young person's response was legitimate.
Yeah. Thank you for that. We have I think we've got time for one question. We got a question come in from Paul on the Substack. It says something about apathy. It's like, how do you handle apathy on students around exams and other large challenges? Any kind of frameworks around that, and specifically thinking about, potentially for high school students around some like high stakes, like ACT, SAT, maybe tests that we're not giving, but as the teacher, as a trusted adult, have a lot of influence.
Yeah. I mean, I think that to address apathy, you have to think about the different sources of apathy. So sometimes students don't care about school in general. Other times they like school or they're okay with it, but they really dislike the evaluative judgmental part of school. And so they don't care about the exams. But other times they perceive the system in general to be kind of unfair and rigged. And so they don't want to play the game that feels unfair and rigged. So, imagine, and a lot of that comes down to the fact that, in America, we do education in a kind of weird way. The teacher is an expert in a source of knowledge in their discipline. And then we teach some things, but we test on some of the things we taught and other things not. So the student's job is to guess the hidden in between the lines information about what is going to be on the exam. And so the student has to do mind reading, basically. And so we withhold information because we don't want to make the exams too easy, right? And that's very different from systems where you've got an external examiner, and then I, your teacher, I'm going to tell you everything I know, and I'm not holding anything back, and it's clear I'm invested in you. So when students perceive at some point this system that we've created that then is used to sort and rank people and determine what their future will be with respect to higher education, then it's easy for them to kind of disengage. And so the shift is to change the focus from the point of this test is to rank and sort and judge and evaluate, to another shift, which is the point of this test is to know where you're at so far so that we know what to work on. And the reason I need to know that is because I'm invested in you and I care about you too much to let you leave this class not having mastered this content, right? And so when the test is just like it's a way to make visible what you've learned so far and what we've done together so far, then it's part of a narrative of my investment in you and my respect for you. And I'll give a very concrete kind of analogy. So my daughter does ballet, and she was at the San Francisco Ballet last summer, and I watched her lessons, like her class. It was like a well-known kind of intimidating ballet instructor. Anyway, she's one of the 30 girls, and at some point he has them do some exercise where it's hard and they have to maintain some pose, and then eventually all the girls fall, but in different directions. Some, from whatever pose they're at, they fall forward. Others, whatever pose they're in, they fall backwards. Others, they fall to the side. And then now all of them are wondering, did I just fall down in front of this intimidating teacher who thinks I'm a bad ballet dancer? Right? So they're worried that this was a secret test of whether or not they're good enough to be in the San Francisco Ballet, right? But he doesn't let them think that. Instead, he says, okay, why did I do that to you? I did that to you because I needed to know which way you fell so that I could know which muscles we need to strengthen. Because if you fell forward, it was like your back muscles, and you fell backward, it was like your core, and sideways is like your hip or your thighs. So it's framing the test not as judging, sorting, ranking, evaluating, which is what in the student's mind, it's information for me to know how to better support you to get to a high standard and a high level. And I love that. And I think the more that students perceive tests in that way, because we've communicated in a smarter way, the more engaged students will be.
Excellent. So I know I said just one more, but do you have a couple seconds for one last one that just came in from Brian? And I think this is a good point because we're talking about exam speeches today. It's just one of the practices. So we've pulled it out to talk about it, but teachers in our program, this is part of a full curriculum that really starts near the beginning of the school year. And Brian's question is, do you set the groundwork for one-on-one communication with students during your first classes with a new group?
Yeah, so we've found that our recommendation is to start every class, basically the school year, with what we call a first day of class speech, where you articulate key beliefs that are going to come up again and again throughout the year. So you say, all right, some of you might be wondering, what does your test score mean to me? Well, let's talk about that. Does it mean I'm judging and evaluating you, or does it mean I'm getting information about how to better support you? Well, it's the latter. If you ask a question in class and you're confused, what am I going to do? Well, I'm not going to get mad at you for asking a question and slowing the class down. Instead, I'm going to be excited that you're helping the whole class learn by surfacing something that probably a lot of people are facing, right? So kind of on and on. That basically it's things that teachers might say eventually, but it would be ad hoc over the year. And maybe it would be week 6 before they said anything about why you should be comfortable asking questions. But that's like too late. Students sitting there for 6 weeks feeling intimidated asking questions, right? It's like, just avoid that. Say it up front. And then that ends up setting the stage for a lot of these other dyadic conversations because it creates a kind of shared understanding up front. On top of that, we have students complete modules. So our mindset modules. So that way the student's mindset is basically prepared to interpret the faculty members' actions in a more charitable light, so that when you take that student aside and troubleshoot a mistake, they're remembering your speech. They're also remembering this bigger idea that mistakes are your friend and you can learn and things like that.
Yeah. All right. Well, thank you, Dr. Yeager, for joining us today. My job for the rest of our time here together. So let's give David wherever you're watching from, you give him a clap in your home.
All right. Or wherever. Thank you guys very much. It's great to see you.
Thank you. So for the rest of our time together today, I really want to just really talk through some of the logistics, the nuts and bolts of the fellowship. As David mentioned, this exam speeches that we just kind of took a deep dive into is just one element that first day of class speech, we also call it the culture of learning speech, is kind of one of the first practices that teachers learn. So it's really, you got to think of it as a full suite of different ways of thinking about, as adults, how we frame our language around key points in the classroom. And the way we do that is through this fellowship, that we call Fuse. So as I mentioned in the very beginning, we kind of have two different times teachers can launch. We'll have a small handful that's actually going to start in March of this year, and then they do their first 2 days during the school year. But then our main cohort launches in the summer. So if you're watching now and you're thinking that this could be a good fit for your campus or your district, this is a great time to start these conversations, because we can talk through, how that would really look. We start with a kickoff here in Austin in June. And so here's just a few picks from last year's event. So we'll have, a couple hundred teachers from all around the country will come here to Austin. We have 2.5 days, of a real high energy kickoff. It's going to be June 16th through 18th this year. We do that event hybrid. So we'll have about half of our teachers will be here in person, half will be joining remotely. And it's not just like a streamed version of if you were there. We have online facilitators who are actively working in groups with the teachers who are joining virtually. So we do everything we can to make that online hybrid version just as engaging as being here in person. But we start with the kickoff in the summer, 2.5 days. The teachers learn their first few practices. They learn that culture of learning speech practice. They think through about the science of memory and really lay the groundwork for starting a school year with making sure practices are in place to make it more likely the students will be able to retrieve information. Most of the teachers in our program are secondary math teachers. That's our main focus, but we do have teachers from other content areas as well. But we are by no means a math curriculum. Every district, every school has their own scope and sequence for math, their own way of teaching math. Really where we come in to support is in that classroom, that math classroom specifically, how are you building a culture that is academically engaged? Students are more likely to raise their hand and ask for help, more likely to understand your beliefs as a math teacher, and that you don't see somebody's results on a specific test, or that they made mistakes as a character flaw in them. So really fine tuning our language as adults to make sure that we're being very transparent, very clear with our young people. Because as David mentioned, if we don't have that clarity, I don't know who else on the call has teenagers. I have 2 of them at home. They often misinterpret my intention, but usually that's because I'm not being clear enough with what I'm saying. So, for example, that exam speech practice we just talked about, your teachers would spend a lot of time crafting their own, 3 speeches, and then they would work with partners, peers, after getting some learning from Dr. Yeager and others. They get feedback from us on ways to fine tune, ways that we think there might be some misconceptions in there before they go and try it with their students. So not a math curriculum by any means, but every math teacher pretty much gives assessments, or every teacher gives some kind of performance task. Or if you're a coach watching and for a big game, thinking through that speech that you're going to give, when everybody knows that big game's coming up, what are you going to talk? How are you going to frame your language that day of the game? And then what are you going to talk about? How are you going to frame your language, whether it's a win or a loss, or whether the student was successful or struggled in their mind on that assessment? So I have a question in the chat. We work with charter schools. Yeah, we work with any type of school, private school, public school, charter school, any and all of the above. We have panels that come in. Dr. Carol Dweck, as David mentioned, she's a key member of our team as well. Uri Treisman here from UT's, been on our panels. Haven't set our panel for this year yet, but those are the types of people that usually join us. But again, that June 16th through 18th is our big kickoff for our 26-27 cohort. And then during the school year, teachers attend 2 virtual institutes as well. So they learn their next 2 practices in the fall, spend a lot of time talking about implementation in the spring. For example, they learn their exam speeches in the fall to really think through how are they going to talk about, finals, or if you're in Texas or whatever state you're in, you might have some kind of end of year test, state exam. How are you going to frame your language about that? And then we talk a lot about how can we help students reframe that stress to better understand that just because they feel nervous about a test, it doesn't mean there's something wrong with them. Doesn't mean they don't belong in that advanced math class. but instead help them understand that that's their body getting ready to do something challenging. This is important to them. That's why they're feeling that way. But throughout the experience, it's very much a continuous improvement cycle. With our teachers, we learn just as much from teachers in the classroom about how specific language is interpreted in different parts of the country, and different ways to really craft a message that lands well with adolescents. So it sounds like a lot because it's a full year fellowship, but really what teachers are doing is really examining their language, how they're talking about their current instruction, the climate in their classroom, things like that. So it's not like a new way to teach math, or you still use the same curriculum, same assessments, same plans, things like that, same unit plans as you would have in the past. So those are the main kind of teacher experiences, is that summer kickoff and then the 2 full day sessions during the year. But interspersed in between those full day sessions, we do have 4 coaching meetings also that the teachers attend. Those happen outside the school day, and they're led by our facilitator team. They're all, either current or very recently former teachers who have been in the fellowship, who have done all the practices, used them in class, been successful with them. They lead those coaching sessions. And those coaching sessions are really just conversations, about, okay, you tried out your exam speech. What do you think went well with your class? Where might there be some misconceptions? What, excuse me, what did you notice with your students? Did more students come in for tutoring afterwards or for a retake than maybe you had in the past? Things like that. So they're pretty low stakes, but it's a great way to keep teachers in the fellowship engaged throughout a year. And that's really our main goal. My past experience was with Round Rock ISD. I'm here in Texas, and oftentimes we would, and a lot of folks do this, we do a lot of training in the summer, but there's this big gap then kind of between when a school year starts. And it's so hard to maintain that professional learning throughout a school year because, we're teaching, we're doing all these other things. So really, once the school year starts, we continue to engage with teachers throughout, but it's a very kind of slow drip of learning, but it's continual. So it's very much not a program where you do all this great learning, this great stuff in the summertime, and then once the school year starts, it kind of drifts away. We really try to maintain that level of attention, throughout a school year, but without overwhelming or without asking for a lot from very busy people who are teaching our students. So those are our coaching sessions. Dr. Yeager also mentioned the student engagement module. So these are a key piece of the fellowship as well, because we want students to be learning the same ideas, that their teachers are. So the students in Fuse Teachers classrooms do 3 modules throughout the year, which they take about 40 minutes, and it helps them better understand that stress can be enhancing, that better understand that reframe of stress, better understand mindset development, better understand like their purpose, and really kind of helping reinforce that idea that yeah, you are seeking status and respect, because that's a biologically natural thing for a teenager to be seeking. Once you hit middle school and high school, we're tuned to make that shift from being just a receiver of support. We're kind of helpless to defend for ourselves, in elementary. So everybody's just kind of taking care of everything we're doing. But as we make that transition, like we're tuned to start, believing that we need to be contributors and we need to have a purpose. We need to help our fellow classmates, our fellow world. And even if we're not showing that, we're tuned to do that. So as the adult in the room, how can we shift our language to tap into that innate need, that innate desire to start kind of proving who you are, improving how you contribute, improving kind of your place in the world. And within these modules, we also ask the students some questions. So we ask them things like about their perception of the culture in their classroom. So we'll ask them things like, students in my class feel comfortable raising their hand. My classroom feels rushed. That's a big one that we talk to teachers a lot about, is like when we say things like, we've got so much to cover today, or got a lot to get through. Things that roll off the tongue. When I was a teacher, I'd say those things all the time without really thinking through like how that's going to suppress somebody's like desire to raise their hand and ask for help, because they don't want to get us off track, or they fear that it's going to be seen as a negative to everybody else in the classroom. It's really being keen on how students are feeling, how they're perceiving that culture. And then the teachers get reports 3 times a year based on those responses. So they'll be able to see kind of how their students are perceiving that culture in their class. And Catherine, maybe you can put a couple links to sample reports in our chats as well, so folks can take a look at those. And we'll send that also in our follow-up for everybody that signed up today. So 3 modules that the students do throughout the year, and teachers receive 3 reports. And then again, everything that we do, I always like to share this slide too, is geared towards, moving that perception of students, whether it's through the teacher modules or the student modules, is changing the perception in classroom away from the idea of a culture of compliance to that culture of learning. So when we talk to students, and with Fuse and with other projects that our team has done in the past, we have so much data on kind of what is that self-talk that teenagers are hearing or interpreting when they feel dissatisfied in a classroom. And oftentimes it's that perception that the culture or the vibe in this room is that I need to go try harder alone, that I'm not going to be supported. And I don't think a teacher would ever say, go try harder alone. When somebody's not successful on an exam or on a project or a homework assignment, whatever it might be. But we believe and we know that through helping teachers shift their language, around key points, whether it's how you talk about mistakes, how you talk about tests, how you structure different activities to make it more likely students will be able to remember, then that culture becomes more of that self-talk of let's troubleshoot collaboratively. Let's see asking for help as a net positive to a classroom versus a detriment. So we'll share this slide with everybody as well, just because it really kind of shows the shift that we're trying to make in the perception of students in a classroom. Just a few last things I always like to share before we wrap up for today. We very much believe that teachers need to be, for lack of a better word, just honored and compensated for their work. And by joining Fuse, and as districts and schools sponsor their teachers to enroll in our program, we always take $1,000 of that tuition that is paid for the teacher and give it right back to them. As long as they are attending and they complete their work or complete the modules, that they're doing with us, and just try them out with their classes, then they earn $1,000 back, $500 at the end of the first semester, $500 at the end of the second. So if what you're hearing today is interesting to you, and you schedule a meeting or we reach out and want to talk more, we can talk about overall costs. But that $1,000 is always part of it that goes back to the teacher. And just a couple of last key points that are kind of part of Fuse, but a little tangentially part. One other element that you would get access to if your school or district or group joined is we do 4 executive leadership series sessions each year as well. Dr. Yeager and others from his network really, they get on, and this is more geared towards principals, assistant principals, superintendents, department directors, folks like that. Different ways that as a leader in an organization, how can you use a lot of these same science of engagement practices with your staff? A couple months ago, and I'll send a link to it. It's on our Substack. If you're watching there, you can scroll down. I think it was behavioral science and leadership. We spent a lot of time talking about, some puzzles that I know I had, as a campus leader and district leader, when you have younger staff that you're working with and you want to give feedback, framing that language so you aren't perceived as being either condescending or you don't want that other person to feel that you think they're immature. We talk a lot about, you have a new teacher and they're about to have their first back to school night or parent conference, different strategies for having that conversation with them. So you're not perceived as thinking that they're incompetent or immature or not ready for it. How to have a conversation with a staff member who might not be dressing appropriately, everything like down into the weeds of conversations that as a leader that you have to have, but how to do that with more of that mentor mindset that we talked about. So these are geared towards all the leaders in the program, but we also invite others. If anybody watching today would want to join any of those, I know Catherine put a link in the chat where you can sign up, and we'll add you to the invite. We also have special guests at each of those. And actually our next one will be February 18th. And Kevin Carroll, he's a very engaging guy here at UT. works with a lot of different companies around staff and employee engagement, works a lot with UT athletics programs about building their cultures and creating that supportive culture, everything from the football team to I think even works with the band and things like that here at UT. So he's going to be our guest in February. If you want to sign up to attend, just go to that website right there and fill out the form, and we'll send you an invite so you can join us for that conversation with Kevin Carroll. And it looks like I just about hit my time perfect for today, just an hour. Like I said, we do these every month, and our goal with these really is to pull the curtain back a little bit on one of the practices that teachers learn, and then hope it resonates with folks on the call. And would love to learn more about your campus, your district, how we might be able to support your teachers the next school year. That QR code right there, you can click on that or scan it and set up a time to chat with me or somebody else on the team about really thinking through how can Fuse support some of your current efforts. Those are our best partnerships, is with districts who have a strategic plan, or have something, a strategic plan that's focused on, improving that culture, improving that student engagement. And one thing that we really pride ourselves on around classroom culture is that we believe the way you improve that classroom culture is how you talk about academics and how you are delivering instruction. And yes, you need to have a good curriculum, you need to know your content, have good pedagogy, but there are certain key points, throughout that lesson cycle when we talk about tests, when we talk about mistakes, when we frame our language about those things that are so key and so critical for making a student feel like this is a culture where I can learn, it's a culture where I belong. And oftentimes there's campus culture building programs that do a lot of great work, and they don't always transition that into the actual instruction. So you could have all this great, posters, planning, all those kinds of things. But then when we talk about the actual meat and potatoes of what we're in school for, some of that goes out the window. So we really work with folks on focusing on that key critical moment when students are learning, and when teachers can really help make that a more engaging environment. So would love to talk to anybody who would like to talk more, whether you want to join or not, just to hear more from your world and how we might be able to support in any way at all. So there's a great picture of our team here at UT. And love that quote from David. It's really designed so teachers can have that library of resources, that network, of colleagues. We've had several hundred teachers over the last few years who have been through Fuse. So they're really welcomed. Our new crop will be welcomed into that collective community as well. So I'm going to put this back up just one more time. If anybody wants to scan that or book a call, and we will see you next month. I'm not sure in front of me what that date on that one's going to be, but we'll put it out on Substack, on LinkedIn. Hopefully, I think LinkedIn might not have been working today for some reason, but we'll make sure that works next month. But that's all we have for today. Thank you so much for joining us, and we will see you next month.